The summer of 1961 was supposed to be a quiet one for Dean Martin. He had his glass of scotch, his cigarette, and the easy California darkness rolling in off the Pacific. He was between projects. The Rat Pack had been tearing up Las Vegas, and he was finally letting himself breathe. The phone by his bedside was for emergencies only. It rang at 2 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, not because he was awake. He answered because that is what you do at 2 in the morning. You answer because something in the human gut knows that a call at that hour is never good news wrapped in a pretty bow. The voice on the other end barely qualified as a voice. It was something closer to a wound, trembling at the edges, catching on itself, trying to form words and failing and trying again. Dean sat up straight in the dark and put the glass down on the nightstand without looking, and he didn't take his eyes off the ceiling because he was already listening with everything he had. It was Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was, at that moment, the most famous woman in the world. She had just wrapped something for the studio. Her name was on every billboard and every gossip column, and every dreaming young man's wall from New York to Los Angeles. She laughed in Technicolor and sparkled under flashbulbs, and the public believed, truly believed, that a woman who looked like that and smiled like that could not possibly be drowning. She was drowning. Dean didn't interrupt. He let her talk. He lit a cigarette, and he sat in the dark of his bedroom, and he listened to Marilyn Monroe tell him, in pieces, through tears she was clearly trying to suppress, what happened, how long it had been happening, and how alone she had been with it. By the time she finished, Dean had smoked half the cigarette down to nothing, and his jaw was very still, and his eyes were very cold. He asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she was safe right now, in this moment. She said yes. The second question was the name of the man responsible. She told him. Dean said, quietly, that she should lock her door and that he would call her back before sunrise. Then he hung up the phone and sat in the dark for 60 seconds. Not from hesitation, but from the kind of deliberate stillness that men develop when they have learned that the worst decisions are the ones made in the first hot rush of anger. Then he got up, put on his shirt, and went to work. The number was $470,000. In 1961, that was not a fortune that evaporated quietly. It was a number that had to be moved through channels, laundered through ledgers, rerouted across accounts in ways that required planning and patience, and the kind of quiet, systematic cruelty that doesn't look like cruelty from the outside. From the outside, it looks like management. It looks like paperwork. It looks like a man in a good suit making responsible decisions on behalf of a woman too busy, being luminous, to pay attention to machinery behind her own name. Her manager had been at this for 3 years. 3 years of percentage points quietly redirected. Signing fees that appeared in contracts, but vanished between contracts and bank accounts. Royalty arrangements that made perfect sense on paper and were constructed specifically to make no sense at all to the woman signing them. He had counted on one thing, that Marilyn Monroe would never check. Not because she was foolish, but because brilliant people who are also deeply exhausted tend to trust the machinery around them. They have to. There's not enough hours in a day to be extraordinary, and also audit every transaction. He had been right. For 3 years, he had been absolutely right. Dean knew the type. He had been in this industry long enough to understand the ecosystem of men who circled talent like that. Patient, invisible, indispensable, slowly fatal. They inserted themselves between artists and their money and their futures, and they squeezed, carefully, the way you squeeze a lemon, slowly enough that the lemon doesn't notice until it's been emptied entirely. What Dean did not yet know, in those first minutes after the call, was that the theft was the smallest part of what was happening. He would learn the rest within the hour. He made a phone call to a man named Gerald, who was an accountant, a meticulous, nervous, brilliant accountant who had been working inside the management firm for 2 years and had been, for the last 7 months, quietly photographing documents with a camera the size of a lighter. Gerald had come to Dean 6 months ago with concerns. Dean had told him to keep going and to keep it quiet and to trust that it would be addressed when the time was right. The time was now right. Gerald answered on the first ring. He had clearly not been asleep. Gerald arrived at Dean's house at 20 minutes past 2, carrying a briefcase and the expression of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and was relieved, desperately relieved to finally be able to set it down. He laid the documents on the kitchen table, and Dean stood over them in his shirt sleeves with a cup of coffee, going cold at his elbow, and he read. The theft from Marilyn's accounts was real and documented and damning on its own. But it was not the document that made Dean set down his coffee cup. It was the second file, the one labeled in the manager's own handwriting, in the kind of careless confidence that men develop when they are certain they will never be found out, simply as a series of reference numbers. 23 of them. Gerald explained it carefully. The way you explain something to a person, you need to understand it completely, without flinching. Over the preceding 9 years, 23 performing artists, singers, actors, dancers, comedians, people whose names have been climbing, whose careers have been accelerating, whose futures have been bright and loud and commercially valuable, had died. Car accidents, overdoses, sudden cardiac events, one drowning, one fall. Each one had signed a new management contract within 18 months of their death. Each one had been heavily insured at the time of signing. Life insurance policies worth between $400,000 and $800,000 per artist, held not in the artist's names but in the names of holding companies. Holding companies that, when you trace them through 3 layers of incorporation, connected back to the same 7 men. 7 men who had, collectively, collected on 23 policies, not accidents. A system. The artists were identified, cultivated, signed, insured. Then, through means Gerald could only partially document, but that the paper trail implied with nauseating clarity, they were destabilized, emotionally, financially, physically, pushed to the edge of themselves through manufactured crises, drained of savings through the same kind of theft currently being executed on Marilyn, isolated from the people who might have steadied them. And then, when the timing was right, when the policy had matured and the emotional destabilization was deep enough, the edge was made a little closer. An artist fell off it. Marilyn Monroe's name was on the list. She was number 24. Her policy had been taken out 4 months ago. Her accounts had been draining for 3 years. The emotional pressure on her, the broken relationships, the difficult film sets, the public scrutiny, the private loneliness, had been curated with expert patience by men who understood that a woman already fighting her own darkness needed only a few carefully placed nudges to lose a fight entirely. Dean stood at his kitchen table at 2:30 in the morning and looked at the name of the woman who had called him an hour ago, barely able to speak, and he understood something with absolute clarity. He had 6 hours before her manager left for Europe. He picked up the phone. The first move was legal. Dean called a Beverly Hills attorney named Harold Fisk at 2:45 in the morning. Harold was not happy about this. He became significantly less unhappy when Dean explained the situation in 3 sentences. By 3:15, Harold had reviewed Gerald's financial documentation over the phone, and by 3:45, he had drafted an emergency injunction. By 4 o'clock, it had been submitted. By 4:30, a judge who owed Dean a favor he had never been asked to repay was reviewing it. The injunction was comprehensive. It froze any contractual enforcement connected to Marilyn's management agreements. It froze the insurance policy. It made her legally untouchable. Any attempt to execute the policy, to enforce any clause, to move any asset, would trigger immediate federal involvement. By the time the sun rose over Beverly Hills, Marilyn Monroe had been wrapped in a legal shield so airtight that the 7 men behind the operation would need years and millions to dismantle it. They would not have years. The second move was financial. The manager had a gambling problem, not a recreational gambling problem. The kind of gambling problem that generates debt, serious debt owed to casino operators in Las Vegas who were, in the ecosystem of early 1960s Nevada, the kind of men who did not wait politely for repayment. Dean made 3 phone calls to Las Vegas. He spoke quietly, and he did not ask for violence, and he did not need to. He simply explained that a man who owed the money was planning to leave the country that morning, that his accounts, which they might wish to consider attached to his debt, were about to be the subject of federal attention, that if they wanted any portion of what they were owed, the man needed to stay put. The airports became complicated for the manager at approximately 4 in the morning. Not officially, not with police or federal agents. Just complicated in the way that things become complicated in cities where the wrong people know your name and the right people know your debt. The third move was the evidence. Gerald's 7 months of photographs represented the most dangerous document collection in Hollywood at that moment. Dean had it copied. 3 copies, 3 different locations, in the care of 3 different people who did not know each other and would not discuss it until told to. 1 copy went to Harold Fisk. 1 copy went into a safe deposit box. 1 copy went to a journalist Dean trusted at a newspaper that was not afraid of powerful men. The 4th move was the one that would settle everything. Dean picked up the phone and called a man named Vincent, who managed a restaurant on Wilshire Boulevard, a private restaurant, the kind that existed behind a door that had no sign on it, where reservations were made by introduction only and the dining room could be arranged, with appropriate notice, to serve something other than dinner. Dean gave Vincent very specific instructions. Then he sat down with Gerald and spent an hour going through the names of 23 dead artists one by one, making a list of who they had left behind. There was something else in Gerald's files, something that took Dean longer to process than the rest of it, because the rest of it was monstrous but impersonal. The work of men who treated other human beings as financial instruments, which was a category of evil Dean recognized and knew how to respond to. This was different. The manager had purchased a secret, a piece of information from Marilyn's early career, a chapter she had closed years ago, that belonged only to her, that she had shared in confidence with a small number of people close to her. The kind of secret that, if it reached the newspapers in 1961, would not merely embarrass her, it would erase her. In one news cycle, it would reduce everything she had built, every performance, every frame of film, every moment of genuine artistry, to a single scandalous headline. The manager had been holding it as leverage, the kind of leverage that ensures a woman continues to sign whatever is placed in front of her and continues to smile on cue and continues to tell herself that the arrangement is for her own good, because the alternative is a revelation of something she cannot survive. The man who had sold him that secret was someone Dean knew, someone inside his circle, someone who had been trusted and welcomed and had accepted that trust and welcome, and then quietly, for money, betrayed a woman who had never done him harm. Dean found him at 5:30 in the morning. He drove to the man's house himself. He knocked on the door, and when the man answered, Dean stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and they spoke for 12 minutes. There was no shouting. There were no threats. There was no discussion of what might happen, because Dean did not operate in the language of might. He operated in the language of will. He told the man what he had done. He told the man that he knew. He told the man that the secret would never reach another living ear, that the document in the manager's possession would be recovered before morning, and that any copy would be found and destroyed, and that the woman concerned would never know her privacy had been compromised. And then he told the man to leave. Not the city, not the state, the world Dean occupied, the restaurants, the recording sessions, the film sets, the late evenings, the circle of people who mattered. The man was to remove himself from it permanently and completely, without explanation, without farewell, without the dignity of a public exit. He was simply to not exist in Dean Martin's world anymore. The man nodded. He looked at the floor. He did not argue, because there was nothing to argue. He had done what he had done, and now he would live with what he had done in the only way such men ever truly live with anything. Quietly, in the periphery, knowing exactly what they gave up and why. Dean left him there and got back in the car. 7 men arrived at the restaurant on Wilshire Boulevard at 7 o'clock that evening. They arrived confident. 2 of them arrived laughing. They were men who had operated their system for 9 years without a single serious complication. And even now, even with whispers of legal activity, even with the uncomfortable news that the manager's travel plans had become mysteriously difficult, they believed, with the absolute faith of perpetually untouched, that this was a situation to be managed, settled, paid off, and put away. They expected to sit down to a negotiation. They expected to write a check large enough to make the problem disappear. They had done it before. The dining room was beautiful. Candlelit, low music, white tablecloths. The kind of setting that makes men feel powerful, that reassures them that the world is as elegant and manageable as the room they're currently occupying. They sat down and accepted their menus and ordered drinks from the waitstaff, who moved around them with quiet, unhurried efficiency. One of them noticed something. He couldn't have said what exactly. Something in the way the waiter who poured his water did not look at him. Something in the stillness of the coat check attendant. Something in the expression of a young woman who cleared the empty glasses from a bar. Not hostile, not angry. Something worse than that. Something like recognition. Before he could process this, the lights in the dining room shifted slightly and a screen descended from the ceiling at the far end of the room. And then a projector flickered on. Financial records appeared on the screen. Bank transfers, routing numbers, account names. The men at the table recognized them immediately because they were their own accounts, their own routing numbers, their own names. The documents were crisp and clearly photographed and annotated in Gerald's meticulous hand, with arrows connecting transactions to policy numbers and policy numbers to payout dates, and payout dates to the names of deceased artists. 23 names, listed one by one, with dates and amounts, and the name of the holding company that had collected on each policy. Then came the audio. Recorded telephone conversations. Not lengthy fragments. A sentence here. A phrase there. Men discussing spacing out incidents to avoid drawing patterns. Men discussing timing relative to policy maturity. Men discussing, in the careful euphemistic language of people who are afraid of direct words, how to create circumstances in which the 23 names on the screen had found themselves standing too close to the edge. The 7 men at the table had stopped breathing in any meaningful way, and then one of them looked around at the waitstaff, really looked, and understood. The waiter who had poured his water was a man in his 60s with the face of someone who'd been grieving for a long time. The coat check attendant was a young woman, early 20s, with the cheekbones of someone whose mother's cheekbones had once been on magazine covers. The bartender was a man whose son had been a comedian, a young, rising comedian with a gift for timing and a future that had ended in what the coroner called a cardiac event 18 months after signing his management contract. Fathers, widows, sisters, children, the families of the 23. There was no shouting, no chaos, no accusations delivered across the room. They simply stood at their stations, and they looked at the 7 men at the table. That was all. Silent, still, sustained eye contact from the people who had been left behind by the system these 7 men had built and maintained and profited from for 9 years. The table began to fracture almost immediately. One man pushed back his chair and said nothing and looked at the man to his left with an expression of pure animal suspicion. Who had talked, who had given this up, who among them had cooperated. The suspicion spread around the table like a fever. Each man looking at the others, the comfortable solidarity of shared guilt curdling instantly into the paranoia of men who suddenly could not trust each other. That was when Dean Martin walked in. He was alone. He sat down at the table, pulling up a chair at the head, the one that had not been set for dinner, and he placed a single folder on the white tablecloth, and he looked at each of them in turn without hurrying. Then he explained what was going to happen next. The manager had not been at the restaurant. His punishment was different. Dean had decided that very specifically, in the quiet of his kitchen at 3 a.m, looking at Marilyn's name on a dead man's list. The others were architects of the system. The manager was the one who had looked at a woman who trusted him, who had handed him access to her life and her earnings and her future, and had decided that her death was more valuable than her continued existence. That required something different from a projector and a legal injunction. A closed theater in Los Angeles. Small, private, the kind where the acoustics are good and the lighting, when focused a single point on the stage, is very bright and very unforgiving. The 23 families were seated in the first 3 rows. The manager was escorted in and placed at a microphone stand at the center of the stage. Dean sat in the back row. He did not speak. He had explained, before the theater filled, what was required. If the manager stood at that microphone and named each of the 23, one by one, and described in his own words, clearly, completely, without euphemism, what had been done to them and how and by whose direction, then he would leave this theater with a 72-hour window. 72 hours to return $470,000 to Marilyn Monroe in full and to leave the country permanently, without charges, without the federal case being activated against him personally. If he refused, all three would move forward simultaneously. The man stood at the microphone for a long moment in the white light and looked at the rows of faces in the dark in front of him. And then he began. He went through them one by one. The comedian, the jazz singer, the actress with the red hair, the dancer who had been 26 years old. He named them and described what had been done to them in the careful, systematic language of someone who had planned these things. And the families in the front rows listened without moving. It took 40 minutes. By the end, the man at the microphone was not the man who had arrived. Something had been taken from him in that room. Not by force, not by threat, but by the simple and devastating experience of having to look at what he'd done while the people he had done it to bore witness. He had spent 9 years behind ledgers and phone calls and the comfortable abstraction of policy numbers. He had never had to be in the same room as the weight of it. Now he was. Dean did not touch him, did not approach him, did not speak to him in the theater at all. As the man was escorted out, Dean leaned toward the father of the young comedian sitting in the front row and said quietly that it was finished, that what had been done could not be undone, but that it would not continue, and that the people responsible would answer for it. Death is mercy, Dean said quietly. Memory is the punishment. At 8 o'clock that evening, federal agents entered the restaurant on Wilshire Boulevard with sealed indictments. Money laundering, insurance fraud, racketeering conspiracy. 5 of the 7 chose prison over cooperation. 2 of them chose to provide testimony about the financial backers who had seeded the original operation and who had been, until that evening, entirely invisible in the documents. The indictments reached further than anyone had expected. Dean knocked on Marilyn Monroe's door at 9:15 the following morning. She answered in a robe with her hair down and her eyes showing particular devastation of someone who had not slept and had spent the night not knowing whether to hope. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. He held up a briefcase. Inside it, in certified funds, was $470,000. Every cent that had been taken from her, returned in full. She didn't ask how. She understood, looking at his face, that there was a version of the answer she could have and a version she couldn't. And she was wise enough and tired enough to accept the one that was available to her. She took the briefcase, and she held it against her chest for a moment, the way you hold something you thought was gone forever. Then she looked at him, and her eyes were very bright, and she started to say something, and instead, she simply started to sing, very softly. A few bars of something slow and grateful, not a performance, just a sound. The way people make sounds when languages run out in music is the only thing left that means what they need it to mean. Dean listened. He didn't move. He stood at her door in the California morning light, and he let her sing, and he didn't say a word until she was finished. Then he said that he would call her tomorrow, and that she should eat something, and that she should sleep. He drove home. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in industry. Quietly, without announcement or public acknowledgement, performers began terminating management contracts that had bound them for years. Attorneys who had never previously been willing to challenge certain clauses found themselves suddenly very willing. Insurance policies attached to management agreements were reviewed, queried, and in dozens of cases restructured or canceled entirely. No one credited Dean Martin publicly. No one spoke his name in connection with any of it. That was not how Dean operated, and it was not what he wanted. He had not done any of this to be recognized. He had done it because a woman called him at 2 a.m, barely able to speak, and she was number 24 on a list of dead people, and he was not willing to add her name to that list. The manager left the country within 60 hours. The 5 men who chose prison received sentences that ensured they would spend the remainder of their productive years in federal custody. The 23 families received a trust fund, established anonymously, that provided for the dependents of each of the deceased artists for the next 20 years. Dean paid for it himself. He never told anyone. Marilyn Monroe lived. She continued to work. She continued to be magnificent and troubled and luminous and complicated, all the things she had always been. She did not escape the darkness that was native to her, that was hers, not manufactured, not injected by men in suits. But she was not pushed toward an edge that had been constructed specifically for her, and she was not alone in the way she had been. She called him, sometimes late at night, not in crisis, just to talk. The way people call the people who have proven, without ambiguity, that they will answer. He always picked up. Dean Martin was not a man who explained himself. He did not give interviews about the things that mattered to him. He did not seek credit for the hours in which he had been most fully himself. The image that existed in the public mind, the easy smile, the drink in hand, the effortless cool, was real enough. But underneath it was something that the image did not communicate. The capacity for absolute stillness in the presence of a crisis. The willingness to make enemies of dangerous men on behalf of people who had no protection. The understanding that power is only meaningful when it is used to shield someone who has none. He had 6 hours, and he used every minute of them with the methodical precision of a man who had decided, very simply, that this was not going to happen. Not while he was alive. Not while he had a phone and a circle of people who owed him, and a mind sharp enough to build a trap overnight. He was not a hero in the way that word gets used. He did not announce himself. He did not make speeches. He sat in a dark kitchen in the early hours of summer morning, and he looked at a woman's name on a dead man's list, and he made a decision. You could exploit talent. You could manipulate fame. You could build systems designed to drain and discard and destroy. But if you came for one of his own, you would not be destroyed with violence. You would be dismantled with something far worse, with precision, with patience, with the slow, total collapse of everything you thought protected you. That is what happened in the summer of 1961. In the space between 2 o'clock in the morning and sunrise, when Marilyn Monroe called Dean Martin, barely able to speak, and he answered and went to work.